Good evening. My name is Archana Prasad and I teach at the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies. And today I'm going to talk to you about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis uh, on, uh, on women. My talk is called Engendering the Epidemic, the Pandemic. Now, why did I choose this title? A little while back, when I was in fact reading one of the reports on the Ebola virus in Africa, one policy maker asked a question: uh, Is the pandemic is can an epidemic be gendered? And the answer to that was basically uh, the answer to that was basically that women and men are differently impacted by any epidemic that hits the country, any epidemic outbreak. Now, the reason why I'm raising this is because I do not think that it's so simple as that. I'm calling it engendering the pandemic because uh, any response to any response to a pandemic is calibrated by existing social, political, and economic institutions. And therefore, the policy response is also embedded in these institutions. And if it is embedded in these institutions, then the since the institutions themselves have a very stark gender bias, naturally, the response is also very gendered in character. Now, let me give you an example. Let me talk about three or four um, mm, uh, three or four recent happenings. The first was the lockdown. In the lockdown, as soon as we came into the first phase of the lockdown for 3 or 4 days, reports started coming that uh, that domestic violence on women is really increasing a lot, and that states have to make efforts to address that situation because any type of a work lockdown puts more pressure on women, be it unpaid work or even in terms of uh, paid work. Now, if we look at the whole question of violence, then we find that the response of different states has been different. I'll come to that later. But that was one thing that happened. The second thing that happened was that the government came out with a set of guidelines. And the set of guidelines that the government came out with were totally inadequate guidelines from any standard. Most of all, with the lack of focus on women. You see, frontline fighters to fight a pandemic like that are not only healthcare workers, they are also the workers who basically protect the social reproduction of the privileged classes. And therefore, and why I'm saying they're also the workers, by that I mean that women are even women are workers in their own house by that standard. And if women are workers by their own house by that standard, then we find that uh, that they face the pressure of any type of lockdown or anything else that you would like to uh, uh, discuss. Now, that's one aspect of it. The second thing, so when the second lockdown was announced, the government very valiantly, because you see, women's organizations have been sending memorandums to the government, all kinds of things have been happening. So the government very valiantly, it puts out a social section in the revised guidelines. And in that social section, it basically uh, uh, it basically states that once in 15 days, Anganwadi workers would do doorstep delivery to people who were registered in their Anganwadis. That's the first thing that it does. And secondly, it says more care should be taken for the elderly and this kind of stuff. So, ostensibly, it is basically uh, uh, responding to the concerns that are made about women and children and all this. But it's also not responding. And I'll come to that later. So that's one aspect of the problem. Is another thing that really happened is that mm, uh, that the UN Women came up with a report, and that report is called COVID-19 and its impact on women. And it suggested certain measures which, according to me, are thoroughly inadequate. But it did outline, very importantly, it did outline this basic spheres in which you have to look for the impact on women. And the first one that they outlined was the economic sphere, where it basically said that even outside India, there are countries where women form 74% of the informal workforce. That was number one. The first thing that it uh, the first thing that it pointed out. The second thing that it pointed out was that this whole thing about working from home and schooling from home, how much pressure it puts on women. And we've read several news reports in England, and even when we personally contact our fellow academics, we find stories about how women are about how women are basically overburdened. They have to log into their corporations in the daytime during working hours, and they also have to do homeschooling. So they are doing the work of, because 1.5 billion children are being made to sit at home because of this pandemic. So there's no real service that, or there's no real social backup for this. Even in the most developed countries, we are finding people are basically that. Now, the third aspect of uh, the third aspect of this is basically the uh, let me put it this way. Uh, it's basically the pressure on unpaid work, on social reproduction and unpaid work. So this is the third aspect that they highlighted. And the fourth aspect that they highlighted was about women in special conflict situations. So these are the four aspects of the report that I'm informing you about, which this UN Women Policy Brief sort of the UN Women Policy Brief sort of put forth. And by putting this forth, in fact, it said that it had made studies and that the pandemic was going to reverse the gains of the women's rights movements. So it took the example of the Ebola and the Nipah virus, and basically talk. There are many studies actually in Africa and from Congo and from Liberia and places like that, where people are actually arguing, and rightly so, that the inequality between men and women has increased because of the outbreak of the epidemic and the lack of a transformative response uh, to that. So, the point that I'm trying to make is that if you want to have a proper response to the pandemic in a socially just way, then the response has to address the inequalities that exist in the society today also, and between men and women as well. So now let me give the fifth area that I really want to talk about is the frontline workers in this pandemic. Now, I came across a very interesting figure. It's true that more than 80% of the nursing staff, almost in all countries in the world, is female. And if you look at the figures of the US itself, you find that 70% of the nursing staff, more than 50% of the pharmacists, and those who test in the labs are women. And these women are basically the frontline warriors in the healthcare system to defend the people against the pandemic also. So, another interesting figure that I found from around the world is that the healthcare workers who are impacted by the coronavirus or who are testing corona positive, out of say around 7,000 in Spain, 72% are women. Out of around a little more than 10,000, a little more than 10,000 in Italy, 68% are women. And why is this the case? This is the case because most of the caring of the patients is being done by women without any protective gear. Now, I can read out some very heart-rending stories to you, where in fact nurses in even developed European countries are basically revealing their mental stress when they are saying that they are afraid to go to work. They are afraid to go to work not only because they've run out of protective gear, because once they wear that gear, there's a sanitary crisis. What do I mean when I say that there's a sanitary crisis? Once you wear that protective gear with 10 layers, you cannot go to the bathroom. There are women who are complaining that they are used to working 8-hour shifts. Now they are working 4 shifts, shorter hours, but 4 shifts a day. So they are working much longer hours. And who can forget the image which was shown maybe 2 or 3 uh, uh, 2 or 3 days back on the TV, where a woman doctor is sleeping in her car because she does not want to make her own family vulnerable to the virus. The second image that is really quite uh, mm, the second image that is really quite telling for me is the image of 2,000 migrant workers at Bandra yesterday. this image of 2,000 migrant workers. Now, I'm talking about the impact on women. 2,000 migrant workers, if you look at them, most of them were men. But the point is that the places where they were going to go back to, they have women family members who are basically taking care of the needs of their families, and who were really depending, a lot of them depending on the repatriation of money too. So, so the impact is not only that you're a healthcare worker, so you're impacted. You're sitting in the house and you have to do much more, maybe 3 times, 4 times more work than you were doing earlier, so you are impacted. If you look at my colony, we have paid domestic help, but 99.9% of the houses, they are not actually uh, uh, actually employing uh, uh, they're not actually employing these workers anymore, and most of them have not got their salaries. And what does our dear Prime Minister have to say? That I request you to pay the salaries of these women. This is not a matter of request, this should be a matter of regulation, that nobody can be laid off. The other thing that we learned from many epidemics earlier on is that because women have greater burden and double burden and triple burden, because many of them work shorter hours in paid work than men, after the economic crisis, when businesses start opening up, you actually have a situation where women's employment is plummeting. And this has happened in many cases in Africa also, that women's employment is plummeting. So it's not only a question of whether lesser women died than men. I mean, this is what the government has been saying, that more men died and lesser women died, and all those kinds of issues that they've been raising. But the point is that, so that was the other thing that was raised. The fourth thing, the issue about domestic violence. I just want to give you some worldwide figures just to make you aware. There are actually 200 and there are estimates that yearly complaints of domestic violence around the world are about 243 million. I don't know whether that's an underestimate. Anyway, but in Singapore and Hong Kong, they recorded within the first week of coronavirus, uh, 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 within the first week of coronavirus, they recorded a 30% increase in violence. In Spain, the first 2 weeks, about 12.4% increase in just the formal calls. And after that, maybe a 270% increase. In France, a 30% increase. In Australia, another 30 uh, uh, percent increase. So uh, so how have these countries tried to deal with it? And one very important thing that I want to tell you, that in Italy, what is coming out is really horrific. It says that women are facing abuse, but they do not want to talk about it. They do not want to talk about it because the survival crisis is so severe. If the survival crisis is so severe, they don't want to worsen that crisis in their household by talking about their violence. And many women's groups are, in fact, many women's groups are, uh, in fact, trying to encourage those women to talk. There are countries where, complaint centers have been made in grocery stores. I don't know whether they are working or not, but I'm just relating to you what kind of things people may have tried, where pharmacists are now empowered to record anonymous complaints with some kind of contacts. So it's not only the police that is responsible, because you know what happens when the police is responsible. We are seeing what's happening in the lockdown. It's become a law and order problem rather than a social coalition and a social solidarity to basically tackle the pandemic. Now, another interesting figure that I want, situation that I want to explain to you, or bring to your notice about the responses of the government as far as the pandemic is concerned. By 5th of April, about 105 governments had announced some sort of a economic package for assistance. Some of these governments did focus on lactating mothers and some of the other vulnerable sections. But if we divide these responses, this is where the important uh, uh, picture comes out. 8.6% of the policies were just simply wage subsidies, incidentally, which this government refuses to give to even informal sector workers. 18.9% of the policies were insurance-based policies, largely for medical personnel. 6% policies were labor market-based policies, which is basically, you basically bring out policies which basically say that you cannot fire people, you have to pay them their wages and these kind of things. Then 22% of policies were social assistance policies, like pensions, like, I mean, in our country, we have widow pensions, interest subsidies, and these kind of social assistance policies. And a bulk of the policies are cash transfer policies. The failed policies of cash transfer in the developing world, at least, that you except maybe Brazil when things were better. Uh, you transfer cash and you absolve yourself of your responsibility. I think largely the government of India's largely the government of India's response has been in the form of cash transfer and some promises for PDS transfer, but not focused on women, but on BPL. Even in terms of free healthcare, now they are saying you have to be in Ayushman Bharat, and that insulting 500 rupees for women's self-help group accounts that and many of the Jandan accounts. So what we really see is that there is a very, very low level response on the institutional backup for women, so that their burden can be eased. What do I mean by that? I mean by that when I say that there's a very low level institutional response, what I mean by that is that uh, the government, or I don't know, in countries, which have much better public health, childcare systems, and all this than ours. But at least in our country, we can safely say that governments depend largely on informal sector women workers to provide even minimal access to partial sort of food and care services, Anganwadis and all this. So it's obvious that the unions which have been fighting for the rights of these women workers need to step up their fight even more. And uh, uh, but I think that a proper institutional response would have been if we regularize the paid caregivers or into the government service and open neighborhood assistance for women who are overburdened with the pandemic. That would not only uh, lead to a sort of a momentary response, but would also help to ramp up the care infrastructure, the neighborhood committees. Lot of socialist countries who are surviving the pandemic have done that actually. The neighborhood committees, mm, uh, 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 the, the primary healthcare systems, the outreach, even with ASHA workers, we are actually putting them at risk by making them frontline workers without any job security, without any wage security, and without any protective backup, even in terms of their health. So I think that we really, if we were to have a better institutional response, it would require that all the so-called voluntary full-time workers within Anganwadis or the midday meals or the midwives or the contract workers, even in the nursing staff, the SFI karamcharis, all these, if we have, if we join, have them regularized and the neighborhood system of care institutionalized, then we move one step forward towards the socialization of care itself. It's obvious that all the difficulties, that all the difficulties that uh, uh, that even developed countries are facing are because of the reversal that European countries are facing, are because of the reversal of their public healthcare policies in favor of private healthcare. And in fact, the reason why the US is in such a big mess is that because they don't have a proper public health system. But a proper public health system means that you don't only have good government hospitals, you also have a proper neighborhood care system. So we can only find an answer to to this pandemic. I'm sure it will go and probably it will come back again because it represents a crisis within the system. Now, so uh, the proper response would have been to regularize the existing cadre that you have and upgrade its infrastructure in a manner that you can have proper care facilities in the neighborhood. That would also move one step further, even in the 1940s, the planning committee, the National Planning Committee's Women's Subcommittee had in fact suggested that, and the bourgeois rulers basically gave it up. I mean, they ignored that recommendation. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is, as far as the employment situation of women is concerned, we are finding that women, uh, uh, that it has plummeted even in the informal sector. More and more women are getting into debt, and that debt is in fact one of the most it's one of the uh, most terrible bondages, because it puts you at risk of all kinds of sexual assault and abuse and various other things. So, in fact, the debt of the family and the women is only going to grow with this pandemic. And because that debt is only going to grow with this pandemic, it is essential that if any subsidy has to be provided, there are two subsidies. One is the salary, the wage subsidy, and the extra care work that women do, some amount of compensation has to be made. Second is the interest subsidy to poor households and especially farming households, which are going to basically really uh, suffer, not because they have a whole lot of COVID cases, but because the supply lines are totally disrupted with this what should I say? I don't want to call it a stupid lockdown, but a unplanned and a unthought out lockdown. An unthought out lockdown. And another 20 days of that lockdown is going to make it even worse. So that unthought out lockdown has been basically done in a manner that will put houses more in debt. It will put small businesses in debt, and it will put greater burden on unpaid family work for even enterprises. And I won't be surprised if child labor also grows because of this. So the salary subsidy, or a, a basic income support for the next 6 months, is the least that we can ask for. The third thing is that the government should stop being so stingy and saying that only people in a highly flawed BPL list can get rations. Even though some governments have made some brave announcement, I think except for Kerala, nobody has been able to achieve this. Even in so so the distribution of food, the unlocking of the go down, and I'm not the first person saying this, a lot of different people have actually said it, that even the unlocking of the go downs and the free distribution of grains is the fourth thing in my mind is that, and I think several doctors have also suggested that the question of lockdown is a very class oriented notion, in fact, I mean, I was listening to Sainath yesterday where he said that there's no social distancing in slums. And now we've started seeing on the social media that, and RWAs, where they've started telling people that be aware of your mates. Be aware of your mates so that they don't give you a virus. But hello, where did the virus come from in the first place? It was not your poor working class that gave the virus to the country. If you had sealed the airports, maybe the virus could have been controlled. So, why jail the entire nation without having a proper plan of action? Why not plan better public transport systems, better, mm, better working conditions where health, hygiene, and even a certain amount of social distancing, I mean, of physical distancing. I hate this word social distancing because, in effect, what you're doing is you're distancing yourself from the most deprived people. You're distancing, you're basically uh, uh, widening the inequality between the salaried middle class, or that also the upper middle class, and the contracted workers and the daily wage workers, and certainly the women in almost all situations. You're just widening the inequality through the lockdown. So, the last question that I want to so the issues that I've raised over here. Curiously enough, the UN Women document, it doesn't actually talk about all this. It only talks about three things: that women should be represented in any committee that is going to make a recovery or a response to pandemic. Mm. Uh, Governmental response to pandemic. They should be institutionally represented. Second, they should be the target group. And third, that there should be an economic recovery package. But it is woefully silent on the institutional response. And why I'm stressing on the institutional response to uh, 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 why I'm stressing on the institutional response to the pandemic is because if we take those institutional steps, it also makes our society a better society after the pandemic. After the pandemic. So, therefore, I think, scattered, ill thought out responses in terms of just doling out money and all, they are good. People need money in their hands for now. But we should also move towards what after that. Tomorrow, if I say we should arrange buses for migrant workers to go home, but when they go home, what kind of support structure are we also going to provide their families so that they can better their well-being, if not survive alone? I think that question also needs to be raised before the attitude that the ruling classes have taken towards this pandemic. So it's all very well to say that we, the people, should be united. Of course, we, the people, should be united, but that unity should not put more burden, whether on the most marginalized groups, whether on the all the working classes, and certainly the women amongst all these groups also. It should not put more burden on them, because the burden on them is not. I see one comment which says that women are natural caretakers. I actually don't agree with this position. I think if we want a truly modern society, then caregiving also has to be equally distributed. And I think caregiving can only be equally distributed if the character of the family changes, number one, and there is an institutionalized collective response to the question of care also. Otherwise, the aftermath of this pandemic is going to be really, really bad for the women. The women are already in a really bad situation, and the aftermath and during the pandemic also and the aftermath of the pandemic, what the pandemic is going to do to the society is going to be really very bad. So I think, what should we do? You know, again, just before I got on to the just before I got on to this live show, there was an email from some police department asking for suggestions on standard operating procedures for domestic violence. Obviously, standard operating procedures is something that we've been fighting for a long time. They should be there, but the only way of also addressing that question for women is enabling them to come out in secure, safe situations where they can do what they want to do. So, lockdown is not an answer to either the pandemic or the problem that women face and the increased burden on women that arises out of that lockdown is really quite scary. It's really quite scary. And I think that once we have a collective discussion amongst what should be done in the wake of this pandemic, because the way in which things are, pandemics are going to keep coming. Society is going to keep getting into a crisis. So the pandemic may be one crisis, but the economic crisis that follows will be another crisis that is going to really, really reverse the this thing. The last point that I want to make is that the pandemic should not be used as a way of let me put it this way, advancing the most socially conservative ideologies of the country. What we find is that the pandemic is also being used as a way not only of stifling dissent, but also furthering the interests of highly socially conservative ideologies, more specifically the BJP and its fringe organizations. And the way in which the lockdowns are being implemented, the kind of fear that is being continuously put by the media and by the government itself is really quite scary. Because with the BJP government, we already have the uh, the revival of neoconservative forces. And if the lockdown is going to be used as a method of, in fact, strengthening these forces and making the communities more gated, more inhuman, and more unsafe, then obviously the task before the women's movement is really going to increase a lot, a lot. And we have, I think, a lot of, uh, and we have really a lot of big challenges before us. I think the women's movement is up against a wall, and this pandemic is going to make it worse. What is going to be our response to that? I think this is something that we need to really talk about and discuss amongst ourselves and come out with some positive suggestions, some that we can do ourselves and which we are doing also, a lot of people are doing also, and some that we must force the state to do. And lastly, I think as far as the question of financing all these things that I've talked about is really, instead of bailing out the industry, I think there should be a COVID tax on the industry, because they have, in fact, milked us enough. Private industry has milked us enough. And their crocodile tears should not fool us, because their surpluses are enormous. They should basically cut down on their surpluses and support their workers through better working conditions, through safe, through childcare facilities, through maternity entitlements, and all these kinds of things. And the government should actually force them to do it instead of pleading with them to contribute to PM CARES funds. Lastly, I just want to again reiterate on that one comment that I've got, that the response to the pandemic is a socially calibrated response. And we have to join forces to make sure that the social calibration is loaded in favor of progressive policies and women. Inkilab Zindabad. Thank you very much.